Hello, all, and welcome to this final event in the Lenin 100 series, marking the centenary of Lenin's death. I'm Sam. I'm an activist with Arise Festival and one of the volunteer team behind Lape Outlook, who've been supporting the event series, which has been very successful. We've had over 1,500 people register for the events overall, with over 20,000 tuning in cumulatively over the whole YouTube series. I'll be chairing today's session with our guest, Steve Howell, who we're really pleased can join us today. But before we get to Steve, perhaps unusually, I'd like to start today's discussion with a short poem from the great Harlem Renaissance writer, Langston Hughes, written in the 30s, called Lenin. It goes, Lenin walks around the world, frontiers cannot bar him, neither barracks nor barricades impede, nor does barbed wire scar him. Lenin walks around the world, black, brown, and white receive him. Language is no barrier, the strangest tongues believe him. Lenin walks around the world, the sun sets like a scar between the darkness and the dawn. There rises a red star. And I think it's a great poem. Lenin's described as this global figure who can't be stopped in his trek around the world, spreading his revolutionary message. And I think it's a good poem to consider today because it captures something very distinctive about his thinking. And what it captures is important because the official infamy of Lenin in the global north is often tied to his organizational methods. You know, this idea he was a ruthless authoritarian and demagogue, although we've seen in other events in this series that view of Lenin is misconceived. It's a misconception. But quite apart from any misrepresentation of Lenin on these sorts of organizational and democratic questions, the really distinguishing part of his politics is where he stood on international issues and his commitment to situating immediate political problems in their global context. And that's reflected in his opposition to the First World War as an imperialist war, which separated him and his comrades from others on the left and was a basis for the split in the Second International of the early 20th century socialist movement. It's reflected in his positions on national liberation and self-determination, ideas that continue to be important today. And we saw that in our Lenin 100 meeting on Ireland, but also when we look at the genocide in Gaza that's happening today too. And it's also reflected in his prodigious intellectual output. Not only was he an important opponent of imperialism, he was also one of the chief theorists of what it was. And you can even find that theory of imperialism reproduced, although somewhat critically, in textbooks today. And again, it was his specific view of imperialism and its barbaric consequences that separated him from other figures on the left at the time, such as Karl Kautsky and Edward Bernstein. And you can see many of the topics of those early debates rehearsed in what people say about foreign policy today. So imperialism is a key concept in Lenin. His opposition to it was why, as Langston Hughes put it, black, brown, and white receive him, and why perhaps the infamy he's received in the global north is balanced by the respect he's accorded in the global south by the leaders of national liberation movements, and indeed in the black liberation movements to which writers like Hughes belonged. To pull some of these threads together today and answer the question, what would Lenin think of the world? We're joined by Steve Howell. Steve is the author of Game Changer, the novel Collateral Damage, and a former advisor to Jeremy Corbyn. He's also got his own regular Substack, which you should all subscribe to, and the link will be posted in the chat, I'm sure. He'll begin with an extended contribution, and then we'll take questions for discussion. So please do put your questions in the YouTube chat. I'm now going to go over to Steve to kick the discussion off. Over to you, Steve. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks, Sam. I've also got a poem, by the way, but unfortunately, it's the other end of the political spectrum to the one that you've just quoted. But I'll come back to that in a minute. It's a bit of Rudyard Kipling. Anyway, to crack on with it, because I'm fearful my notes are going to make me go on too long, and I'll try not to digress. I think the interesting thing about this is that when this date was arranged, which was several months ago, we didn't know whether Trump was going to win the election or not. But Trump has actually provided us with some very rich material to, I think, have this to use in this discussion. You know, at the end of this week where he has been inaugurated, you couldn't really have wished for more in terms of the material that provides almost a sort of parody for an imperialist president. Trump tends to say things out loud that most US presidents have, over the years, dressed up in hypocritical but worthy sounding language about a rules-based order and Western values. But with Trump, you get it, you get it in its crudest, often vulgarist form. And you also get the visual impression that we were left with from the inauguration of him being flanked by 5 billionaires. And again, in that respect, he's just being more brazen about the role of billionaires in US politics than Democrats have traditionally liked to be, certainly in recent decades. But nonetheless, Democrats have still had close relations with billionaires like Bill Gates, George Soros, and Michael Bloomberg, and they've had the inside track to the White House. But they weren't paraded in the same crude way that Trump paraded his 5 billionaires during the inauguration. And if you go back further, you can see that the seriously rich have always played a larger than life role in US politics. You had the oil baron John D. Rockefeller in Lenin's day, and also Andrew Carnegie, also in that period, the steel magnate, the media mogul William Randolph Hearst in the 1920s and 30s, who founded the original America First movement and was a fan of Hitler. And then you had, of course, Henry Ford and Joseph Kennedy, both fiercely anti-Semitic and anti-communist, who also saw Hitler as an ally. So the history of US imperialism is littered with characters like Elon Musk. And therefore, Trump parading these people around is not in substance particularly new. What I think is more interesting from the point of view of what Lenin might have made of all of this is Trump's eulogy for President McKinley, a name that certainly wouldn't be a household name in Britain until Trump started talking about him. In his inaugural address, Trump said, "We will restore the name of a great president, William McKinley, to Mount McKinley," that's in Alaska, by the way, "where it should be and where it belongs. President McKinley made our country very rich through tariffs and through talent. He was a natural businessman." Actually, McKinley was a lawyer, not a businessman, but he was backed by Rockefeller and also by J.P. Morgan in the election of 1896, and his presidency was from 1897 to 1901. He was assassinated, by the way, in 1901, so he didn't serve a second term. And this ties in neatly with Lenin saying in his booklet on imperialism, he says, "For Europe, the time when the new capitalism definitely superseded the old can be established with fair precision. It was the beginning of the 20th century." Now, Lenin doesn't specifically include the United States in that sentence, but he does in the same section of the book refer, when he's describing the concentration of production into giant monopolies, he uses two US examples, and he uses Rockefeller and the Standard Oil Company, founded in 1900, the turn of the century, and the United States Steel Corporation, which was created from a merger of Carnegie Steel and the Federal Steel Company the following year to create an entity that employed over 200,000 people and produced about 70% of US steel. Lenin might have added that actually that merger to create the United States Steel Corporation between Carnegie Steel and the Federal Steel Company was actually orchestrated by an investment bank, J.P. Morgan, which had itself only been formed 5 years earlier. So here we have the concentration of capital, the concentration of industrial capital, and the role of finance capital in orchestrating it and funding that concentration. Exactly what Lenin was describing is embodied in that presidential period, or happened in that presidential period that Trump is talking about. So I think it's interesting that Trump identifies himself with that exact moment that US reached the monopoly stage of capitalism. Now, what's also significant about McKinley, I think, is that, and Trump didn't mention this, which is interesting in itself because he tries to portray himself as a peacemaker, was that in 1898, McKinley initiated a war with Spain that resulted in the US annexation of Cuba, Guam, the Philippines, and Puerto Rico. These were the first territories to be annexed by the United States outside the landmass of North America. The war with Spain lasted only 9 months in 1998, and the resistance in Puerto Rico and Cuba was relatively quickly crushed. But in the Philippines, although Spain was defeated quickly in the Philippines, resistance of the Filipinos lasted a lot longer, went on for another 3 years. And it took a brutal war in which tens of thousands of Filipinos were killed by the US forces for the US to gain full control of the Philippines. Now that war, and here comes the poem, I'm not going to read the whole thing, by the way. That war was popularized by Rudyard Kipling in a poem calling on the US to crush the Filipinos, saying that they should take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed to harness their new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. That's what I mean about it being the polar opposite to the one that you spoke about, and I think that's a very apt contrast of the nature of imperialism versus the spirit and nature of the poem that you read of anti-imperialism. Now, there was actually strong opposition to McKinley's war in the Philippines, which was continued after he was assassinated by Theodore Roosevelt. And because it prompted the formation of what was known as the Anti-Imperialist League by Mark Twain and others. And even a number of senators spoke out against what had happened in the Philippines, one of whom, George Hoare, spoke of American soldiers returning from the Philippines broken in mental health, and said, "You have sacrificed 10,000 American lives, the flower of our youth. You have devastated provinces. You have slain uncounted thousands of people you desire to benefit. You have established reconcentration camps. Your generals are coming home from their harvest, bringing their sheaves with them in the shape of other thousands of sick and wounded and insane to drag out miserable lives, wrecked in body and mind." Now, I don't know if, some of you who are listening to this will have been to the States, but I think anyone who has been to the States will have seen that a lot of the homeless people on the streets of the United States are actually veterans who have come home wounded, sick, and broken to drag out miserable lives. And so that's the backfire, if you like, of imperialist wars, not only the destruction and killing that they cause in the country where they take place, but also the effect they have on those who are dragooned into fighting those wars for the imperialist power. The Philippines remained a US colony until 1946. Of the other three territories taken from Spain in 1898, Cuba became independent immediately, and Guam and Puerto Rico are still US possessions, for reasons that I think are fairly obvious when you look at an atlas. The two islands, those two islands, Guam and Puerto Rico, give the United States priceless military outposts in the world's two great oceans, the Pacific, and in the case of Puerto Rico, where the Caribbean meets the Atlantic. Now, excuse me a second, my notes are out of kilter. So Trump doesn't talk about any of that. He doesn't talk about the wars that McKinley launched. Incidentally, during his presidency, he also annexed Hawaii. So he was a full-blooded imperialist president. Um, Trump tends to talk about focus, as he did in his inauguration address, on protective tariffs. Now, Lenin says of the question of tariffs versus free trade, this only gives rise to insignificant variations in the form of monopolies or in the moment of their appearance. So it may influence the form that the development of capitalism takes, or the development of specific industries might take, and the timing of the development of the concentration of capital and of monopolies, but it doesn't fundamentally change anything. In the case of McKinley's tariffs, I think they probably speeded up the concentration of capital, particularly for the steel industry, but that was going to happen anyway. And likewise, the questions of war and peace are not really questions of policy. Hoare may have opposed the policy. The senator I was quoting, Hoare, may have opposed the policy of colonial conquest in the case of the Philippines. But war and colonial conquest are inherent in the monopoly stage of capitalism, and they have characterized monopoly capitalism throughout the 20th century and continuing into the 21st century. So for Lenin, war, just like with tariffs, are a secondary question, but with war, he sees it as inherent in imperialism and not a matter of policy, and not actually making any fundamental difference. The policy may, I'll come back to this in a moment, but an imperialist power its leaders may have particular views on which wars to fight, but the drive to war is inherent in the appetite of imperialism for colonial domination and in the export of capital specifically. So that leads me on to talk about the specific things that Lenin attributed to the monopoly stage of capitalism. He wrote this book while living in exile in Geneva in 1916. When carnage was taking place around him. The Battle of the Somme, the Battle of Verdun were actually taking place as he was writing this book. 2 million people died. But that war also stretched across the whole planet, the Middle East, Asia, and Africa, and 17 million people died in it. And it was a war to redivide the planet between different imperialist powers. And as you mentioned at the beginning, Sam, that question of war split the Socialist International, with some so-called socialists deciding to side with their capitalists in the war against other capitalists, and Lenin and many other socialists saying, no, we're against this. This is an imperialist war. So that was the context in which he was writing. And as I say, he didn't see imperialism as a policy. He saw it as a special stage of capitalism. And he characterized it with 5 basic features. Firstly, monopolies dominate whole branches of production. I appreciate you may have done this in some of the earlier sessions, but I think it's worth recapping. Monopolies dominate whole branches of production. There's comprehensive socialization of production, but under private ownership. So that's the first point. The second point is banks take command of almost the whole of the money capital of all the capitalists. And that leads to the creation of a financial oligarchy separate from industrial or productive capital. That's the example I gave earlier, like that JP Morgan emerged as an investment bank controlling the merger of the steel industry, the consolidation of the steel industry, providing the capital from investors for that to happen. And then thirdly, capital accumulation reaches such gigantic levels that the export of capital, that the developed capitalist countries start to export capital on such a scale that that becomes more important than the export of goods in their economies. It acquires what Lenin called exceptional importance. And then fourthly, the major capitalist monopolies have carved up by this stage of capitalism's development the world's natural resources among themselves. And then finally, the capitalist powers have in turn carved up the territorial division, the political division, if you like, of the world among themselves. Lenin discusses the implications and the byproducts of this, of which two in particular, I think, have a huge bearing on the history of the 100 years since Lenin died and where we are today. And the two I want to look at are firstly how the export of capital created what Lenin called parasitism. It created a stratum of rentiers, people who live by clipping coupons. And at the same time, that has led to a decline of domestic industries. So I want to look at that question of parasitism. And then secondly, I want to look at the question of inter-imperialist rivalry and the continual drive for domination that we've seen by the imperialist powers over the and to a large extent among the imperialist powers for domination. While Lenin, first of all, taking inter-imperialist rivalry first and how that shaped this 100-year period. Paradoxically, inter-imperialist rivalry, although it occurs, it's inevitable in Lenin's view, and I think we've seen plenty of evidence of that. It doesn't always serve its main protagonists well. Before the First World War, France, Germany, and Britain had a combined GDP greater than that of the United States. But by 1920, just after the war, their combined GDP was about half that of the United States. So the countries that had instigated the First World War and had done most of the fighting came out of it far worse than the United States, who had sat on the sidelines and only entered the war in 1917. And within that, Britain's GDP had gone from half the US figure to a quarter of it. So there was an acceleration of the decline of British imperialism relative to US imperialism. By 1938, an aggressive Nazi-led Germany had rebuilt its GDP to just over half the US figure. So it had regained some ground against the United States on its own. But Britain had only recovered to about a quarter, from a quarter to a third of the US figure. But between them and with France as well, they were catching up again to the United States. But World War II then gave US ascendancy a really massive boost. And again, the US entered the war after Germany, France, and Britain. But it came out of the war with this much strengthened position. In 1948, it had a GDP more than 4 times bigger than that of Britain, France, and Germany. So Britain, France, and Germany had gone into the war with much the same GDP as the United States. By 1948, their combined GDP was a quarter that of the United States. That post-war US ascendancy had nothing like that had been seen before. I mean, British imperialism, even in its heyday, didn't have such an overwhelmingly dominant position. And that meant the United States, and I think Grace covered a lot of this ground in her last talk, the last talk. That meant the US could impose a dollar-centric financial regime on the capitalist world. It could compel European capitalist countries to buy US goods through Marshall aid after the war. Britain's weakened position allowed the Americans to muscle in on the British Empire and promote self-determination disingenuously as a cover for their own economic domination, backed at times by military force as in Iran, the coup, as in Iran, rather, in 1953, I think I'm right in saying, and by military force at times, and by assassinations of African leaders, as I think has been discussed in previous sessions, and with sanctions. So you saw the Americans not, as in McKinley's day, directly annexing territories and turning them into colonies, but certainly gaining a great deal of power in the continents where British imperialism had been dominant, particularly Africa and Asia. And in that context, I think you can see the creation of the State of Israel, which was a means by which the United States could establish a stronger position in a region that was previously a battleground between the European imperialist powers. So the US was so strong that, unlike British imperialism, even in its heyday, it could largely impose its hegemony on the other imperialist powers. And that tendency was reinforced by the existence of a common enemy in the form of the Soviet Union. But in spite of that, nevertheless, inter-imperialist rivalry has never been far from the surface. When Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt in 1956, the US threatened sanctions against Britain because it didn't see that intervention as being in US interests. Britain kept its distance from the US in the Vietnam War, much to the annoyance of the Americans. France wouldn't allow its airspace to be used by US planes to attack Libya in 1986. In the mid-1980s, the US punished Japan for its post-war economic sense through the Plaza Accords, forcing the revaluation of the yen. And then in 1987, the United States imposed sanctions on Toshiba because it was ahead of IBM in microchip production, using its trade with the Soviet Union as a pretext. You roll the clock on another 16 years, and France, with its own interests in the Middle East, didn't join in the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And most recently, the US was opposed to Germany developing the Nord Stream pipelines, and it has exploited the war in Ukraine to make Europe heavily reliant on US fossil fuels, weakened the European economies, which I think is a big gain that the Americans were looking to make out of that situation. So while rival imperialist powers aren't strong enough to contemplate war with the United States, of the kind of wars we saw, the First World War and then the inter-imperialist character of the Second World War, they do still have their own interests, which often diverge from those of the US. Meanwhile, within the US ruling circles, the differences between Trump and the Democrats are not about whether to impose US interests on their rivals and on the world, but how to impose them. The Democrats see NATO as having served them well, and Trump is much more prepared to act unilaterally. I was going to say something in this context about British imperialism, but I can see time is marching on. So I think if anyone wants to talk about the particular place of British imperialism in all of that, I'll answer a question on it. But one thing I would like to say before I move on to parasitism is to say that you shouldn't think of Britain as no longer being an imperialist power. It's a much weakened one, but in certain sectors such as banking, arms, oil, mining, and pharmaceuticals, it remains a significant imperialist power with far-flung global assets and interests. And I think that's important in understanding why some retired generals periodically come out of the woodwork and say we need much more spending on arms so that we can fight a war on our own, because they know that there may be a situation where Britain does fight a war without America's active participation. Anyway, so inter-imperialist rivalry, inter-imperialist rivalry is still an important thing, even though with US hegemony, it's to some extent been pushed into the background and the sidelines. It still does surface, and there is still that tension between the US and the European imperialist powers and Japan. But I want to go on to parasitism before I finish. And hopefully I've got about 5 minutes, Sam, have I? Yeah. Um, because it's the parasitism of imperialism that arises from its export of capital that is particularly driving the Trump agenda. As I mentioned earlier, Lenin saw the export of capital as one of imperialism's key features. And what we've seen over the last 30 or so years has taken that to new heights, heights that might surprise even Lenin. The term globalization began to be used in the 1990s to describe this, and all that is really is what Lenin was talking about with the export of capital. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the US thought its hegemony was so complete that it could indefinitely dominate the world economically. And therefore, it didn't matter where US corporations based their production. They should do it wherever it was most advantageous, because whatever happened, the US had unrivaled power, and it was considered that the end of history had been reached. This was this would not change. And so we saw the export of capital increase massively. In the 1970s and 1980s, according to the International Monetary Fund, the stock of foreign direct investment was only about 6 to 10% of global GDP. So the export of capital that Lenin was talking about was not overwhelmingly dominant, as it were, in the world economy in the way that it has become. By 2015, the percentage of foreign direct investment in global GDP, relative to global GDP, was 60%. So a massive increase from 5 to 10% to 60%, nearly all of it emanating from the imperialist countries. And the exponents of this globalization thought they could have it all ways. They thought they could take advantage of cheap labor in India, China, and other countries, producing cheap consumer goods for the domestic markets of domestic consumers of the imperialist powers, particularly the United States. They could enforce it if necessary through military might, and they could pay for the cost of that military might and the resulting fiscal deficit simply by issuing more and more government bonds, which investors would buy as long as the dollar was the world's currency. And of course, they also used that to fund the trade deficit that they had with countries like China. But both those trade and fiscal deficits are now becoming unsustainable. And countries like China and India have themselves not been content with simply being suppliers of cheap labor. So globalization has backfired badly for the imperialist powers. In 1990, the US economy was 16 times the size of China's by GDP. By 2017, the start of Trump's first presidency, the US economy was only 50% bigger than China. So it's gone from a multiple of 16 to 1 to a multiple of 2 to 1. And now it is only just over a third bigger. So parasitism has left the US and other major capitalist powers vulnerable. And as the Times put it the other day, it's impossible to remain a superpower without making stuff. They've reached a point where their domestic economy is just simply not producing most of the things that they need, not just to fulfill the needs of their consumers, of their own people, but also to fight the wars that underpin the military power that underpins their global position. Lenin noted this. He not only noted the export of capital, but he noted that the numbers employed in basic industries within the imperialist countries was declining. He noted that Britain's percentage employed in basic industries had declined over the latter part of the 19th century. That trend has continued and accelerated. So in the UK, we had 8.6 million employed in manufacturing in 1970, 4.37 in 1997, 2.7 million now. Similarly, in US manufacturing, employment fell from 19.3 million in 1979 to 12.8 million in 2019. Meanwhile, China has 112 million people employed in manufacturing, and India has 18 million employed in manufacturing. And of course, China and India have now joined forces with South Africa, Brazil, and Russia in BRICS, and 6 other countries have also joined them. I've posted something on Twitter about BRICS because I know I haven't got time to go into that, but BRICS now accounts for 30% of global GDP. So Trump politically represents a reaction to the way in which globalization has backfired, and the need to do something about it. And US policy on China shifted during his first term, with some sanctions and tariffs imposed on China. And it continued, and if anything, accelerated actually under Biden, who last year increased tariffs on electric vehicles, for example, from China from 25% to 100%. And now this trade war is set to escalate under Trump, and likely to include tariffs against his imperialist rivals. So the inter-imperialist thing cropping up again. Trump's inaugural address was full of rhetoric about America becoming a great manufacturing nation again, about how it would once again consider itself a growing nation, one that increases our wealth, expands our territory, builds our cities, raises our expectations, carries our flag into new and beautiful horizons. Well, if that isn't a declaration of imperialist intent, I don't know what is. The difference between Trump and Biden is not over whether to fight wars. That, as I say, is inherent in imperialism itself, but over which ones to fight. Biden prioritized Russia, but Trump sees China as the bigger threat, hence his rhetoric about China controlling the Panama Canal, hence him having designs, hence his talk about China having designs on Greenland. Interestingly, to go back to the McKinley point, just to finish now, the Panama Canal was built by McKinley's successor, Theodore Roosevelt, who also got a mention in Trump's inaugural address, but he credited McKinley with having created the economy that would allow Theodore Roosevelt to build the Panama Canal. The thing is, in those days, the US was a young imperialist power with an immense domestic industrial base. It's now an elderly, chronically parasitic, heavily reliant on the dollar's increasingly threatened global dominance. It's an imperialist power that is in need of in need of life support in many ways. Perhaps life support's a bit of an exaggeration, but it's certainly elderly and chronically parasitic. And I think if Lenin looked at this, I think he would say, well, it bears out everything he said. His point about imperialism being a stage of capitalism, not a policy, doesn't mean that policies are irrelevant. I think that Trump's policy of protectionism could have the effect, it's possible that it could have the effect of slowing down or partially reversing the US decline relative to China. But it's also possible that that policy could have the effect of accelerating it. My guess, and this is now definitely to end on, is that the US economy and political system will prove too sclerotic to change very much. But the trouble is, and so Trump's agenda will, I think, at some point begin to run into the buffers, not prove that effective in its own terms of trying to restore the United States relative to China and other rivals. The trouble is, though, the huge amount of suffering that, of course, Trump's pursuit of his agenda will mean for many millions of people in the United States as well as worldwide. And whatever he says about being a peacemaker, which he says, I think, purely for opportunist reasons to pander to get the votes of war-weary Americans, whatever he says about that, he could launch new wars on any number of fronts, over the Panama Canal, over Greenland, who knows what. So it's a dangerous and a volatile situation in which the fight for peace remains inherently an anti-imperialist fight, and which makes Lenin's work on the subject still, I think, very, very relevant. And I must say, I read it again twice in the last few weeks, having not read it for 40 years. And I found things in it that I found that I'd forgotten about or had not really understood the significance of. But really, really, when I read it again, I thought how brilliant a piece of work it actually is. Of course, some of it is a bit dated, but not very much. Anyway, with that, Sam, um, I'll go back to you.
Thanks so much for that, Steve. That was great. A really kind of wide-ranging contribution as well, to get kind of further discussion kicked off. Before I go to some questions, just to say we've got loads of people on the call. It's fantastic how many people have joined us on YouTube. Tuning in from London, from Bedford, Cardiff, Liverpool, Chelmsford, Cornwall, Mid Wales, and Oxford, but also Norway, Chile, Botswana, and Brazil. Welcome to everyone who's tuning in from across the world. The second thing to flag, our partners in this series of events, Arise, have a range of events themselves coming up, including a day school on the 29th of March, which will discuss these kind of issues and be a really great forum for doing that in person. So please do check out the day school. Links to that will be on how to register, will be posted in the chat. And then finally, just a real plea throughout this meeting, this event, you'll have seen a donate button posted repeatedly in the chat. Please do donate. It's how we put on events like this. We have overheads like the YouTube, because of the size of the events we put on. The YouTube costs us money. Advertising those events, costs us money. So yeah, there are resources that go into this, and your donations are therefore are really helpful and really fundamental in terms of pushing the messages out and the kind of educational events that we've done with Lenin 100 and Arise, going forwards. So yeah, thanks very much for tuning in today. And if you're enjoying this, please do donate. So yeah, having said that, to turn to some questions. The obvious one, Steve, that you primed, which is a sort of chair's dream, was how does British imperialism fit into all of this? You talked a little bit about, or extensively about, the funding competition with China and the US and the subsidies to military spending and how that was funded through printing more money effectively, but obviously the mechanisms of that are a bit different, and we've just seen a recent tranche of new military spending announced in the UK, so I'd be interested to for you to kind of expand more on how British imperialism fits into the kind of narrative you presented. Second question maybe, and then we might come back for some more if we've got time. You touched on Palestine and the issue of Palestine. Obviously, Trump today made those very kind of outrageous remarks, really talking about how the role of the way to peace is to clean out Gaza, and that's that would be kind of a merit, or suggested that would be US policy in the region. I thought it would be interesting if you could talk a little bit more about that and how that relates to the US's kind of imperial aspirations in the region and its overall kind of strategy for the region. So yeah, two questions to get us kicked off. How does British imperialism fit into this, and how do Trump's remarks today also fit into the argument you've made?
Well, I think British imperialism definitely has its own clear interests. When I say clear, I don't mean in the sense that they're always obvious, but they clearly are there. I mean, for example, on the Ukraine war, Britain has been much more belligerent and in favour of, through successive prime ministers, in favour of escalating than Washington, surprising as it may seem. And that possibly could have, I'm speculating, but that possibly could have something to do with the fact that Britain has big oil and mineral mining interests in not just in Ukraine. I mean, it has some mineral interests in Ukraine, and some aspirations in terms of lithium, but also in that whole region, as far as Kazakhstan, for example, in that whole sort of Central Asia kind of region. So geopolitically, I think Britain has its own distinctive interests and aspirations in particular regions that are not necessarily seen as being as important by people in Washington, who are looking at other regions as being more important. And I think it is significant that of the world's top 10 mining companies, 3 are British, 3 are Chinese, 1 is Brazilian, 1 is Indian, 1 is Australian, and only 1 is American. But the world's biggest mining company, Glencore, is essentially a British company, and Rio Tinto, I think, is the 3rd biggest in the world, and BHP is the next. So Britain's mining interests are colossal globally, all over the world. I mean, Glencore has big mining interests in Kazakhstan, as well as in Africa, Latin America, Australia, Canada. And I think this helps to explain why people in the military industrial complex, if you like, in Britain's own military industrial complex, see it as being very important to drive up arms spending, so that Britain has this capacity to be able to intervene independently of the United States or NATO if it wants to. And that's going to put a huge burden. I mean, Starmer is going along with that largely. It's going to put a huge burden on public spending. So I think this is an important thing to, for us to appreciate. On the question of Palestine, the thing that Trump did that was quite clever was that he got Saudi Arabia and Israel talking, which he often boasts about. And I think the difficulty for the Americans now with their strategy of supporting, a very hardline position on Israel, leaving aside, the horrendous nature of it in terms of its impact on Palestinians and the genocide, and that's words fail you really. But just looking at it geopolitically, I think that they have a problem, because if they continue to support this very aggressive stance of Israel's, I think it's going to be very difficult for any Arab countries to deal with them. And so, what is their strategy ultimately going to be? I mean, they're in the short to medium term, they might succeed in continuing to kill and annex, and it may appear that they're to some extent winning, as they have, I think, to some extent won in Lebanon in defeating Hezbollah. But I'm not sure where it goes ultimately, because the reaction in the Arab world, the anger in the Arab world, is so strong that no Arab government, I doubt, is really going to want to deal with Israel, and they haven't succeeded in destroying Hamas, which they claimed was the main goal. And most people didn't think they would, because the history of Israel's aggression is that they drove the PLO out of Lebanon in the 1980s, but that only created the conditions for Hezbollah to emerge, because of the anger over the slaughter that Israel had conducted in the Lebanon in the 1980s. For those who don't know it, the Shatil and Sabra refugee camps, and the bombardment of villages in the occupation of southern Lebanon. So each time these things happen, it creates a reaction, and it creates it kills an awful lot of people, but it creates also a more determined resistance. And I think even even by if I was an imperialist in Washington, I think I would be saying, this is a strategy with no end in sight, and it's not ultimately going to get anywhere. I think the Americans were on to more of a winner when they were trying to split the Arab world and split the Palestinians by embroiling them in some kind of partial settlement, some sort of mutation of a proper two-state solution. So I don't see it ultimately going anywhere, but the short-term effect of it will be horrendous. Clearly, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in terms of what you said about actually the kind of the consequences that has for sort of resistance movements, kind of actually brings me on neatly to the kind of next question that I wanted to sort of go to, which is, we've talked a lot about the sort of relationship between kind of imperialism and colonized peoples. I think what maybe perhaps we talk less about is the relationship between imperialism and its own sort of domestic policy. And obviously we've had that recently. Chris Ninen was arrested for as a part of his role in organizing the Palestine solidarity marches, and we've seen actually throughout the last 5-year period attacks on the right to protest. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the way that imperialism shapes the sort of domestic policy of its own country. And in fact, we started at the beginning, before things started, you were talking about Angela Davies and kind of there was struggles against racism in America, and so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what imperialism does to the domestic policy of the imperialist country, and how it ends up treating its own sort of own population too, and how that relates to resistance.
Yes, well, in Trump's inauguration address, he said no longer will the FBI be weaponized against its political opponents. But he didn't mean, when he talked about his political opponents, he meant people like him. He wasn't talking about people like us, because during his campaign speeches, he said that pro-Palestinian demonstrators, student demonstrators, would be deported if they were foreign students. And he said that'll make them behave if we tell them they'll be deported. So it's quite clear that Trump is going to be repressive towards people who protest on issues like that. The FBI is going to continue to be weaponized against them. And in similar vein, on Friday, I think it was, Vice President Vance said, he quoted Nixon saying, "The professors are our enemies." Now, I looked this quote up, and it dates back to December the 14th, 1972. And I remember it well because I was in the United States at the time. I don't remember that quote, but I remember the context well. And the context, there's a transcript of it now online, which I posted yesterday on Twitter. And the context of it is a conversation between Nixon, Kissinger, and General Haig. And they're talking about blitzing North Vietnam over Christmas 1972. And I can barely speak about it because it still upsets me. But for 11 days and nights, they bombed Hanoi and killed hundreds and hundreds of civilians, destroyed hospitals. They just relentless 200 B-52 bombers day in, day out. And I remember my father writing to me from London. I was in New York, and saying it upsets me even now, but he was the whole family went to stand on the steps of the US Embassy in London with other protesters. So that was the context that Vance was talking about. and boasting about. The professors are our enemies. And in this conversation, Nixon is sort of ridiculing the fact that this war crime, which is what it was, would be condemned in the press. He says the press are our enemies as well, and the professors are our enemies. And I think Vance quoting that reflects the mindset of these people around Trump, and how they're going to treat any kind of dissent. And before we know where we are, we'll have what we had in the 1950s, which is where academics had to sign oaths of allegiance, and if they didn't sign them, they would be dismissed. And those were specifically anti-communist oaths of allegiance. They had to declare that they had never been a member of the Communist Party, and a lot of people refused to sign and were summarily dismissed, including a very close friend of my father's. So I think that's the sort of situation that we're now facing, and I think that we'll see that happening in Britain too. We are seeing that happening clearly with what happened last weekend with the Palestine protest, and I think it's, the fight for democracy and democratic rights and protest rights is very much a part of the fight for peace and the fight for the interests of the working class in Britain generally.
And what fantastic words to finish our session on today. I think that kind of is a really kind of a galvanizing thing to kind of, even if it came out of quite a horrific kind of episode, that's a kind of galvanizing message to finish on, I think. So listen, thanks so much for joining us today, Steve. That was a really, really, really wide-ranging discussion that I found incredibly interesting. Again, a plea to the people on the call: please do donate. Use that link that's posted in the chat, and please do check out the Arise Festival pages that have been posted too. And if you can get to the day school in March, that would be fantastic to see you there as well. Steve, have you got any kind of last words to finish with, and then we'll finish with those, or we can close the meeting?
Only to thank Arise. I think you all do a terrific job, and it's really appreciated, I know, by a lot of people. So thank you for having me, and thank you for everything you do. I really do think you do a great job, and I hope people will donate as you've asked.
Thanks so much, and see everyone later.